Hello, everyone. My name is Anant Jhingran, and I'm the CEO of a company called StepZen that delivers GraphQL APIs against any backend, whether they are databases or, for the purpose of this talk, REST APIs. Today, I'm going to address what's called the channel problem, and let me just dive straight in. So the channel, which is a massive feat of engineering, connects England to France. And as you all know, you drive on the left in England and you drive on the right in France. And whether you're starting from France or whether you're starting from England, somewhere in the middle, you kind of switch the direction and you're seamlessly on the other side. Okay. And so channel is just an awesome way in which two different perspectives are kind of brought together and merged in the middle. A similar problem exists with respect to the front end backends. So the front end people who are building experiences are driven by being able to quickly access data from the backend, but access data in their concepts, a customer, an order, a product, or whatever else it is. And the backend has got data that is scattered across multiple systems because they reflect fundamentally the views of how data should actually be stored and be transactionally consistent and everything else. It's turning out that GraphQL is becoming one of the key ways in which now front ends want to access data. And you guys can all go and read about GraphQL. I'm not going to get into it. But just to kind of give you an example, here's a GraphQL that allows a front end developer for her to actually paint a screen that takes a customer information, looks at all the undelivered orders of the customer and finds out their delivery status. Now, of course, this particular query, GraphQL query, is wonderful for the front end, but it needs to be connected against various databases, for example, or against certain sets of APIs. And therefore, the GraphQL engine has to kind of be able to make some REST calls or some SQL calls and everything else. So the critical question is, how are you actually building this connectivity? Are you looking at the backends? Let's assume for a minute that backends sit in France. Are you looking at the backends and then generating the front end view of them? Or you're starting with a consumer view and then kind of connecting the dots? And both of those concepts are perfectly valid. So you can, for example, start with a consumer view. And in the consumer view, for example, let's say that you're building a mini app for weather. You may look at you may declare a type query which returns the weather associated with a city, and the only fields that you actually care about are the temp and the description. And that particular query may end up executing a REST call, in this case against OpenWeatherMap, and will make those appropriate parameter substitutions. And then when that REST call happens, OpenWeatherMap returns data that looks like this, and then that data has to be actually mapped back into how the front end really wants to see. So in the world of starting from the consumer, the consumer perspective is the king, and the back end is being mapped into the consumer perspective. But you can start from the back end. You can start from France, and the backend may have an OpenAPI spec. In this case, the OpenAPI spec is for Dev2, which I presume many of you use. And you can take that Dev2 backend that kind of describes all the things that the backend can do, and you can auto-generate a GraphQL API. And I'll show you some examples of that later on in the demo that I do. And so fundamentally, what's happening is that you're starting from the backend and you're generating this kind of GraphQL queries like get articles. And the good thing is, of course, the comments from OpenAPI spec, if they're done properly, can actually be brought in and written into the GraphQL world. Now, of course, if you don't have an OpenAPI spec, which unfortunately happens to be more often than all of you would like it to be, there are other tricks that you can do starting from the back end. You can actually submit queries. In this case, we are submitting queries against Airtable that doesn't have an OpenAPI spec. And we look at that and you can introspect it and generate certain fields associated with it and certain GraphQL specs associated with it. So either way, you can either start from the front end or you can start with the back end. Neither of them is perfect. It kind of gets you 80, 90% of the way, but then you have to edit and modify for the last 10 or 20%. And the reason for this gap fundamentally is that there is an impedance mismatch. Okay, the views of the front and how GraphQL expects it are different than the views of the back and how REST actually produces the data. As an example, the channel problem itself the channel itself might not be buildable. I'm going to try to carry this channel concept a bit through. Sometimes it'll break, but stick with me. So channel may, when you start digging for the Dover side, you may be going in this direction. And when you start digging for the France side, it may go in a different direction. And the two actually may end up never meeting in the middle. So for example, you may end up creating, you may want to list out the set of products associated with an order. And for that, you kind of issue a query against orders and then issue a query against products. And it's all fine and hunky-dory. But for example, if you want to kind of create an API, a GraphQL API, where you want to be able to generate the list of orders for a particular product. So for example, if a product is going to get recalled, you may actually want to generate the list of orders associated with that particular product, or if the product is delayed or discontinued or whatever else it is. This particular query may actually be unimplementable in the world of REST because there's no way to go from product to orders. There's only a way to go from orders to product. So here's an example of where starting from the consumer view, you may actually end up with an unimplementable perspective on the backend. The speed in the channel might be really slow. Okay. So for example, let's say that you create a very nice front-end interface which allows for a customer her orders and the products that the customer has. And that's absolutely awesome. But that particular query that you might ask for, give me some details about a customer, may end up making one call to the customer to get the customer details, and then 50, if the customer has 50 orders, 50 calls to get the orders, and then 200 calls to get products associated with them. So you may end up doing kind of 251 calls for every customer that you actually have. And what that does is it basically makes that 400 milliseconds that you have to paint the screen is lovely to have kind of a GraphQL perspective on the left, but the REST implementation and the OpenAPI implementation on the back is not conformant or performant with respect to that, and therefore you kind of run out of it. So here's an example of where it can be executed, but it need not be executed well, whereas the previous example that I gave, where it cannot be executed at all. The traffic from one side can actually blind you. Okay, so as you guys have built out your OpenAPI spec, you have kind of thought through a lot of issues. What data do you want to produce? What is the stuff that people want, et cetera, et cetera. So over time, you've said, let's build out an API for X and let's build out an API for Y. Let's add this parameter and let's add that parameter and let's add this and that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a very thoughtful set of investments that you've done. But the net of it is that the OpenAPI specs are like this with so many endpoints. And when they're brought into the GraphQL worldview, so for example, we have brought into GraphQL in StepZen, 3 different OpenAPI specs, a cloud immersive one, which is really about text analytics, Dev2, which of course is about publishing articles that many of you use, and Etsy is Etsy. And here's an example of suddenly the front-end person is overwhelmed with all the choices, and it's not exactly clear that too many choices really is good from a front-end experience. But from a back-end perspective, it makes sense to offer all the options, but then really something has to be done in order to make sure that the front-end person doesn't get kind of overwhelmed. So here's an example of backends and information on backend and OpenAPI spec potentially overwhelming the front-end. A few road signs might be missing. Okay, so what we have seen is, as we have been kind of looking at OpenAPI specs and seeing what can be done with respect to GraphQLization of them, here is an example of abstract APIs OpenAPI spec, and it's all great. It's all great, except that you see that the connection type has been declared of type object, which is that instead of creating it as a ref, it has been created as a type object. And of course, there are fields underneath it, but the whole wrapper has been made into a type object because somebody felt that it was either not worth it or not worthwhile or not worth the time that he or she would spend in order to make that happen. GraphQL, on the other hand, is very strongly typed. Okay, and therefore, the way this kind of right-hand implementation will come on the left-hand side is that you'll have to kind of convert all of it into a JSON because that's the kind of standard type for kind of catch-all for everything else. But then the JSON types are opaque. You cannot really access autonomous system numbers and all that within the context of GraphQL because it's not viewed like that. So, but if you really want to access autonomous systems numbers and other things, then you have to actually declare a new type that has got these fields, etc., etc. So what's really happening is that the way the kind of type and type definitions and enforcements are done on either REST or OpenAPI Spec are really somewhat looser than what's done in kind of GraphQL perspective. And the two have to be kind of matched and aligned. I like to think about it in terms of programming languages. JavaScript is loosely typed. Golang is strongly typed, and the two are just different. Okay, but kind of getting a Golang developer to work in JavaScript, etc., becomes kind of difficult, and the two have to be kind of brought together. And therefore, people have come about and said, let's kind of add TypeScript as something that kind of introduces stronger typing or really strong typing to the world of JavaScript. Similarly, the world of REST is kind of very loosely typed, whereas the world of GraphQL is very strongly typed. And then all of you who have helped build out OpenAPI Spec have kind of said, let's kind of introduce strong typing. But as you saw in that abstract API example, the fact that these constructs exist doesn't necessarily mean that everybody follows it. And therefore, the OpenAPI specs still have kind of looser typing than what would be expected out of GraphQL, just as one example. So what we have found is that only about 1 in 10 OpenAPI specs are kind of complete and can be brought in without some modification and hacking and other things around it. And therefore, these OpenAPI specs, even though they exist, may not be sufficient for GraphQL, or these OpenAPI specs, even if they exist, are kind of out of band and out of sync with respect to the actual implementations that exist out there. Sometimes OpenAPI specs may not exist at all. Okay, so for example, here is a set of popular APIs that our customers and our developers and others are using in the context of StepZen, and all of these are really, really high quality APIs, except all of them don't have OpenAPI specs or don't have OpenAPI specs that are usable directly. Okay, we actually found that only about 1 in 50 good APIs, I'm not talking about the dustbin of APIs, really, really good APIs, only 1 in 50 have OpenAPI specs. And why is that? Spec creation, fundamentally spec creation is an independent process from API creation. You can create APIs without creating spec. And therefore, spec creation in many cases happens to be an afterthought. Okay, people create specs for docs and then they hide those specs. Correct docs matter, but there are ways to get to correct docs without necessarily going through OpenAPI spec. And then the spec, of course, might be deliberately hidden. And that's the case of some of the more popular APIs out there. In contrast, in GraphQL, every schema is introspectable, unless, of course, it's explicitly turned off. And then there's no way to create an endpoint without its schema. Hence, it is always present and always correct. You make a change, your schema that is hopefully introspectable changes along with it. Okay, and therefore the two are always in sync. And this philosophy is a philosophy of GraphQL that I really love, and it's something that the larger community in OpenAPI specs, OpenAPI has to kind of think through. There are other impedance mismatch problems between the two sides. The pagination model is pretty common in GraphQL, but it's a run at in REST. The filter and selection model is ad hoc in GraphQL. It's equally ad hoc in REST, but the two ad hocs are different, and therefore you're always running into some impedance mismatch problems. Okay, versioning is a problem, and authn and auths are kind of different. Versioning is awesome in REST, but is not that good in GraphQL, not standard. And authn and auths is awesome on both sides, but then in GraphQL, you've got to kind of take care of a few other things. Okay. So the REST and DB investments fundamentally are building blocks. And we have a strong belief that decades of investments in good, well-built APIs that have captured business logic, et cetera, either within an enterprise or third-party services is fundamentally important. Similarly, decades of investment in databases is fundamentally important, even though I didn't talk about how databases are brought into the world of GraphQL, but both of them need to be brought into the world of GraphQL. And today, I talked a bit about some of the challenges and opportunities on the arrow on the left. So there's leveraging REST and backends has to really be important, but then you have to kind of figure out how that impedance mismatch, either starting from consumer view or the producer view, has. Okay, so we have talked to you about GraphQL and REST and open APIs, and let's kind of bring some of those things together as a demo. So what I've done is I've set up an endpoint for you that contains two backends, in this case, CloudMersive and Dev2. And what each of those endpoints has been created by us introspecting the OpenAPI spec and schlepping it. And as you can see, as I talked to you about, given that there's a lot of capabilities available, you get a lot of these queries and endpoints. But the good thing about GraphQL is that this is kind of completely introspectable, and the queries and the types and everything else are all determined on the fly by this tool called GraphQL that's going and introspecting that particular backend. So for example, you may choose to ask for articles by a user called Remote Synth, somebody that we really like, Brian Rinaldi, and you can see what the article that he wrote and what is the description of that particular article. And here's an article on Hugo, which is an awesome SSG, and he wrote that article on 20th of April of this year. Okay, and that's absolutely awesome. But one of the things, as we discussed, is that the backend can actually overwhelm the front end person because there's just so much of stuff available to you. So what we have done is, as we have kind of introspected the backends, we have created a lot of these GraphQL SDL files through some automatic introspections, and you can see the comments have all kind of come forward and everything else. And that's the really beautiful power of OpenAPI Spec and of course, beautiful power of GraphQL. But at the same time, fundamentally, it's kind of overwhelming. So what we have done is we have kind of created these smaller snippets by just kind of commenting out stuff that is not really relevant for what the front end might want to do. All of this has been commented out. And then the only thing that's available is the kinds of queries that you expect the person to ask. In this case, they have to get articles. And so let's go and create a new manifest by changing the previous ones to now only deal with these ones. And the good thing about how we work in StepZen is that this is actually automatically being saved, and then it'll get deployed. And once it gets deployed, let's go and see what has really happened. And now you only get those two endpoints. So one of the things that you might want to do in your channel perspective is, as you start from the back end, you may want to use that as a starting point and then curate it, modify it, change names, etc., etc. So these are awesome. You can still ask the same questions. But there's another beautiful thing about GraphQL is that now you've got REST and OpenAPI specs from two completely different endpoints. You can actually connect the dots. And in this particular case, because CloudMersive has got language detection capabilities, let's connect the dots and let's see what the language of what the developer has actually has actually written. And so let's go and for the same user, let's ask for the language. And in this particular case, the language will take CloudMersive requires a key. And let's go and look at the language. And of course, let's look at what the description and when the stuff was created at. So look at the power of GraphQL. I'm asking for the bits, but I'm also kind of connecting the dots. And let's go execute this particular query. And now what has gone is fetch data from Dev2 by doing all the channel traversal back to the backend, but then has kind of looked at it and then combined it with this. So combined it with CloudMersive and determine the language with exactly what it is. So the good thing about GraphQL is that it's able to kind of connect the dots, and if you can kind of make these kind of channels and paths happen between backend and front ends, then you can actually get some awesome experience. And we also showed you some things with respect to curation by kind of removing some of the queries that you would not be interested in. Okay, so that's what I have here. Let me just kind of end the talk by saying thank you very much, and we are open for questions that you might have, and I'll be very happy to answer the questions. But otherwise, check us out on StepZen.
Okay, you guys now have me. Are there any questions? Marsh, you once taught me how NoSQL versus RDB came down to knowing how you will get the data out versus not. Is that one way to view OpenAPI versus GQL? So let me just parse that again. You taught me a lot more, Marsh, than what I taught you, but I'm so happy that I taught you something. How NoSQL came down knowing how you will get the data versus not knowing. Okay, that's perhaps exactly right. In the case of GQL, you really focus on the what, not the how, and really the kind of the bit parts that need to get assembled in this, and it allows the front end person to kind of focus on the what. In kind of the REST worldview, you're kind of binding closer to the how implementation. So that's definitely one way of looking at it. And the job of a middleware like StepZen and others is to kind of translate between the what that comes in a GraphQL language into the how that gets implemented in REST at the backend. So that's a great question. Awesome. I know it's near the end of this awesome conference, so I'm sure that you all just totally loved this presentation and everything else, and have no further questions. But I'll wait for a couple of more minutes, and then I'll let you all go for kind of the closing keynote. Okay, Kevin. Hello, Kevin, again. How widely used spread is the use of GraphQL? I'm a technology writer and I've seen a lot about GraphQL in this conference. I may want to write about it. I'll just tell you this. Estimates are that there'll be, GraphQL has been around for a few years. It came out of Facebook, as you know, Kevin. But fundamentally, the estimate is that there'll be about 1 million new developers who will become GraphQL proficient over the course of next 2 to 3 years. And one thing I'll just tell you is I've been, of course, talking to lots of enterprises as part of what we do at StepZen. And I've just been amazingly surprised as to how much of GraphQL is going on. And Marsh would remember that the inflection period of REST adoption within enterprises happened around 13 or 14. And then it just kind of completely flipped. And I feel that in GraphQL, this is going to happen in a couple of years. So GraphQL is really, really, it is just better and is being fairly widely adopted. Thank you, Kevin. Do you have thoughts on Steve Rice's question? Do you have thoughts on trying to determine types at runtime for fields that untyped? Can this be successful? Yes. So if you look at what some of the tricks of trade there are, that you look at kind of the responses that come out of it and try to figure out whether you can kind of encapsulate the responses in certain things. Akita, for example, I suspect that for those of you who went to GeneStalk, is trying to do something like this. And we also strongly believe in query by example, that if you give enough examples and if you know kind of native types of those examples, you can probably decipher the type of the root object. But in the end, there are always some escape clauses like a JSON type or others. So this fundamental problem, when it was created, it was not typed, and when it's needed is typed, can only perhaps be solved when a developer comes in and solves it. But some automated tools can partially get you there. And happy to have that further conversation with you, Steve, separately. Okay, those are all awesome questions. So it's 1:54. Let's just, oh, wow. Dan, hello, Dan. Aside from the query curation that was demonstrated, is the only answer to impedance mismatch between GQL and REST careful design? No, absolutely not. I actually don't believe that at all. So there are like a lot of impedance mismatch issues. So let's kind of talk about performance. Performance is one impedance mismatch issue. So in reality, the naive implementations of GraphQL do this kind of 1:n explosion. But a lot of backends actually have this kind of data loader patterns. And it's entirely possible that if the layer in the middle is smart, it can actually figure out how to go from calling one uh, query for every top level record and kind of filling out its child field to kind of assembling enough top level records and then kind of calling them. That's just one example where kind of smart implementations and optimizations can actually take care of this. And there are lots and lots of other issues that can actually be handled with respect to these kind of impedance mismatch. But again, over time, I think that conventions in GraphQL will get stronger and better, and tools and tooling will improve for these kinds of automatic impedance mismatches. But we have some distance to go, and that's why companies like us try to make some smart decisions and try to make those things work. Okay, awesome questions. And once again, it's absolutely phenomenal meeting some of the faces that, not faces, at least virtually, some of the people that I've known. And if you get a chance, do check us out. But I think GraphQL is really, really important. And I think that REST and OpenAPI represents such a huge investment that it cannot be throw the baby out with bathwater. And what I've tried to highlight is some of the things that you've got to kind of think through, and some of the things that where tools and products such as StepZen can actually help, but something that all of you have to get on that journey. Okay, take care, everybody, and awesome having you on. Okay, if Zain had a question, Zain, when we say a problem is a run at, what does that term mean? It just means that everybody kind of takes that as an afterthought and does whatever she feels like or he feels like, as opposed to it is kind of completely specified. Okay. Take care. Thank you, Zain. Okay. Take care, everybody.